Hello and welcome to episode 104 of Decentralized Revolution, a podcast from the Libertarian Party Mises Caucus and Mises Caucus PAC. I'm Liam McCollum and I'm your host for today, and my guest is Germinal Van. I've known Germinal for some time now, and I think the last time I interviewed him was 3 years ago on my own podcast, and I have the privilege to speak with him again today. He immigrated to the United States in 2010 from the Ivory Coast. He's an extremely prolific writer, very accomplished, and he's written nearly 24 books at this point, I think, and at a very young age. He's also an award-winning economist. It's really a privilege to be talking to you again.
Thanks, Ian. Thanks for having me on your platform.
Yeah. So how many books are you at now?
I'm actually okay. So normally it's 25, but physically it is 26 because my latest book, a history of wealth distribution, it's a 2-volume book. So book 25 and book 26. But since it's on the same subject, normally it should be book 25.
Okay. Okay. Well, so for the audience anyone in the audience who doesn't know you, I've had the privilege to talk to you a few times, and you have an awesome story. Why don't you just introduce yourself, give a little bit about your background and what attracted you to the United States and economics?
Sure. So, in fact, it was a big progress. I always knew that I would come to the United States at some point in my life. Since age 10, I always told my mom that one day I will be coming to the US and live here. And once I got my high school diploma, I came straight here to go to school. I came with a student visa. I went to, I graduated. So I graduated in 2014. I took a year off. Then I went on to do my master's in political management at the George Washington University in DC as well. And I studied political management there, and I graduated in 2017. So political management is basically the practical aspect of politics. So it's for people who wanted to become like campaign managers, like chief of staff of politicians. So it's basically professionals in the world of politics. And so I did that. I applied for jobs anywhere. It was really hard. And then I started getting interested to go to law school. And because I was like, I wanted to become a politician in the US. So, and I realized that the conventional path in America to become a politician is to get your bachelor's, then get your law degree. Usually you either go to corporate law, you become like a district attorney, then you run for the legislature and other political offices. So that was the path I wanted to take. I took the LSAT 3 times. It was hard. The language barrier was a real issue, specifically when it comes to you have to answer on the LSAT, you have to answer like what, 35 no, you have to answer 25 questions in 35 minutes, and it's written in a quite tricky language. So it's hard, like to think, translating your native language and come back, and it was hard. But I still managed to get into 2 law schools. But the economic situation even wasn't right to go at the time. So I ended up not going, and I started writing. And my first book was basically on political science, on American government. And as I started writing, I think I got into economics after my 4th book. And that's when I started being accustomed to economics. In fact, the way I got into economics was because I became more accustomed to libertarianism, which is interesting. Because libertarianism is basically the political philosophy that is very economics driven. When you look at Democrats or Republicans, sure, they have the economic views, but it's not centered on that. Compared to libertarians, every libertarian know pretty much about economics, especially free market economics. So that was the logical follow-up. So I started reading about libertarianism, Milton Friedman, Thomas Sowell. I always knew about Hayek. In fact, Hayek was the one that got me into political philosophy. In school, I read The Road to Serfdom, and it made me like a a pretty conservative guy because I agree with pretty much everything Hayek said. And then so when I started reading Friedman, Thomas Sowell, and Ludwig von Mises and all these guys, so I started getting more into technical economics, and then my books became more technical on the field of economics, and that's when I started training myself in mathematical economics and econometrics, and then I eventually even got a job as an economist for a software company. Then I work also for a logistic supply chain company as an economist. And after that, I was kind of like tired of working for people. I always knew that I want to have my own business. So, and then I started getting to finance as well. And then I started my company. So now I own two companies. One is a publishing company, and the second is the Lake Street Review, which is the newspaper, which is the online newspaper that I started. I would say 2 months ago, pretty much.
Now, when I last interviewed you, I believe it was about your book about the Nobel Prize in Africa. You had kind of developed this idea of introducing a Nobel Prize equivalent within the country of Africa to spur innovation and economic thinking.
Yeah.
In the Ivory Coast, as I understand it, is fairly classically liberal, and that environment attracted you to the ideas of economics. Is that right? I'm trying to remember what we talked about.
Yeah. So no. So the way. So what you said is pretty accurate. Ivory Coast is one of the countries that has always been economically liberal. That is why we have like pretty much we are like the most advanced African country among all the French-speaking countries in Africa. And but what got me really to work on this book was that I look at the Nobel Prize and all the people who won the prize, and I realized that there was not that many Africans. And the reason why is not, of course, about no because they're racist or no. It's not that. It's just that there are other factors. In order to win the Nobel Prize, there's certain factors that need to be in place. And one of those factors is to be one, a professor in a country like the United States or Canada, or even in Western Europe, maybe Japan to some extent. So you have to be in one of those areas. Otherwise, if you're like an economist in Montevideo in Uruguay, no. Even if you develop the best economic theory that is worth of a Nobel Prize, you're not going to be acknowledged. So you have to be in certain countries, and you need to be a professor in certain schools. So you see that there is a pattern, and based on those patterns, you realize that I realized that there were like Africans will not really get a shot. When you look at Africans, they only won the Nobel Prize for literature and peace. You never really saw, like, when I say Africa, I mean Black Africans, because there's white South Africans who won the Nobel Prize for medicine. Yes, they're African administratively. But when it comes to Black Africans, none of them won the Nobel Prize in science. So, and I realized that it's something that kind of bothered me. But at the same time, as I said, like, they're not in the right, the factors necessary for them to be considered for the Nobel Prize are not there. So I was like, if you're not in the United States or in Canada or in Western Europe, you can write all the papers you want. You can develop all the best theories you want. It won't matter. So at this point, I was like, why not creating our own Nobel Prize then? Our equivalent, which will put forth, African intellectuals. So that's when Jean-Philippe and we had the idea, and then I talked to him about the idea, and he was hooked, and he was like, "Let's do it." So, and then we use a very data-driven approach to write the book and make sure that it was compelling.
And then you also have a book on classical liberalism within Africa, and I think that's the first book I ever interviewed you about.
Yeah.
For the audience, maybe people aren't very familiar with African politics. What is? I mean, I think a lot of people might be surprised to hear that the Ivory Coast has embraced capitalism. I think there might be a stereotype about African politics. So what is the general landscape? How would you describe Africa as a whole? And then how would you describe the Ivory Coast?
Okay, so that's actually a great question. Um, everything's so in order to understand African politics, you need to understand colonialism and independence, because these are the two major phenomena that shaped African politics and African economics. So many African countries in the post-independence era, so in the 1960s and beyond, went down the socialist route. And that was because of the influence of Lenin. Lenin wrote a book on imperialism, and for Lenin, imperialism is basically the last stage of capitalism. So it's capitalism at an international scale. And he was saying that, so that's when he developed basically what we call the dependence theory, saying that rich countries are rich because they're exploiting the resources of poor countries. And it's from that notion. So Africans saw uh, capitalism with imperialism. So they were like, if we embrace capitalism, therefore we are embracing the oppressor, because colonialism is imperialism. But what people don't understand is that colonialism is not capitalism. Colonialism is mercantilism, right? Because mercantilism is based on the it's an economic system in which the wealth of a nation is determined by the quantity of raw materials, precious metals, and other commodities, right? And since those are finite, therefore a country needs to go conquer other territories to get those resources. And that's why you have slavery and colonialism. People didn't want to enslave people because it's fun. Maybe they did enjoy while they were doing it, but initially it was to increase the wealth of the country. So that's why you see colonialism like Canada or even the US in the early 1600s, right? That's when colonialism happened in the United States. But that was because mercantilism at the time was the dominant economic system. And even when you look at the map of Africa, right, the two major European powers that colonized Africa are France and Great Britain. France colonized specifically West Africa because they lost the war against Germany in 1870. So they were completely ruined. They need to rebuild the economy. And one of the ways to do that was to go and colonize Africa in order to get the resources. So you see again the mercantilist mentality here. So mercantilism, so slavery is compatible with mercantilism, not with capitalism. But Lenin missed that part completely. But since people read Lenin, and to them, capitalism and imperialism is basically capitalism on a global scale, we cannot adopt that economic system, because doing so is to support what the oppressor did to us. So that's why many African countries went down the path of socialism. So they went down the path of socialism for political reasons rather than economic reasons, because anyone who understands economics will go the route of capitalism. And that's what Ivory Coast did. So our first president was one of the very few to embrace capitalism. He did not believe in redistribution. He did not believe in collectivizing resources. He believed that the wealth of a country is based on the amount of goods and services that people produce. And the goods and services are produced through voluntary exchange. We need to have property rights. But one common thing that all African countries had was that they were politically authoritarian, because of the Cold War between the 1960s and 1990, they all had a one-party state. There was no multi-party politics there. Every country had a one-party state. And But economically, that's when they were different. And Ivory Coast made the right choice by embracing capitalism. And in 1970, we had what we call the Ivorian miracle. That's when the economy was at its peak, and the living standard of Ivorians was much higher most most West Africans. And many West Africans were coming to Ivory Coast to study, to live the same way, Africans come to Europe for a better life. It was the same, literally the same. And that tells you and shows you again the power of capitalism. When you let people freely pursue their self-interest, they end up contributing to the greater good. Adam Smith talked about in The Wealth of Nations. He was not lying about that phrase.
Yeah, well, that I really appreciate that. How does, I guess, modern politics, how does the current state of politics in Africa as a whole play into, I guess, international politics that we're seeing today? Because you recently wrote an article on the IMF and their relationship to African countries. And there's been a lot of talk recently about the United States, through their foreign policy and their monetary policy. They've kind of isolated themselves in a sense, and that they might be more attracted to countries like China. And there's this Belt and Road Initiative where it's kind of being sold as China is offering them these predatory loans in competition with the United States. But then there's also this joke that when the United States tries to influence countries, they get a rant, and they get they're basically criticized for their cultural values, whereas China doesn't do that. It's merely economics. Whereas the United States is very concerned about women's rights or whatever woke agenda on the global stage. So is that analysis correct? Because that's kind of my very superficial understanding of geopolitics and international politics right now. How would you say Africa is in its relationship with the United States and trade?
Okay. First of all, your analysis is correct because, as I explained in the article, I forget, there's an article I posted where I say that Africans should not see Russians and Chinese as their ally, and I distinguish the two sort of colonization. So Western colonization focus on political colonization. Political colonization is coercive because what you're trying to do is to completely change the person's identity. That's what the Western colonization was about, like specifically the French. Like they try to completely transform you into someone new. Like they make you speak the language, their language. You have to abide by their laws. Basically, everything they do, you have to do that. So that's what the United States was trying to do, and Africans are not supportive of that. They try to impose, woke culture and LGBT stuff on Africans. Like, we are not part of that. Why don't you do that with the Saudis, right? Why don't you try to do that with the Middle East? You don't, but you're trying to do that with us because you have leverage over us. So, but the Chinese don't bother with those stuff. And that's why Africans are turning more toward China, although they're aware that Chinese don't necessarily love them or don't have the best interests at heart. But at least the Chinese don't bother them with culture. The Chinese are not trying to impose their culture to reshape the African man. It's a new form of colonization, is economic colonization. The Chinese are very determined. They're here to do business with you. And one thing that is I notice is that people don't read contracts. When you get into business with someone, contracts are long, it's tedious, so people just go to the bottom of the page and they sign. But within the contract, that's where everything is elaborate. And if you don't take the time to read it, it can have serious consequences when you're on the losing party. And that's what has happened with Uganda. The Ugandan government took a loan with a Chinese bank to for a infrastructure project. Specific, I think it was to renovate their airport, and the Ugandan government could not pay back the loan, but it was stipulated in the contract that we're going to use your airport as collateral. If you fail to pay back the loan, this airport is going to be ours. And this is what happened. And then Africans complain, oh, the Chinese, the racists, they look at the colonizing us. Like, no, they had a contract with you. You did not read the contract, you signed, and you failed to pay back your loan. And now your own airport is in the hand of the Chinese. So you see here that the Chinese did not use force at all. They did not come with weapons and the military force and take over. No, they say, hey, we have a contract. We're waiting patiently. And they wait. The Ugandan government defaulted on the loan, and now they own the airport. So, and it is the same. So it is the same concept that is going on with the IMFs. Like a lot of African countries are taking loans to fund their projects, and a lot of them default on the loan. And because they default on the loan, that has economic consequences. It basically affects, number one, the reputation of the country. So when you come to the international bond market, people do not want to loan you money because you're a bad debtor. You're not going to pay back the loan. So creditors are fearful of you. It reduces economic growth because now people who are producing the goods and services, everything they're producing is to pay back the loan rather. So basically to come back to zero, right? Instead of adding value to the economy, which will lead to positive, which will bring positive output. So basically, everything they're producing is to cover up a negative balance, because African governments spend a lot, so they get into budget deficits, and it's the people who are paying the consequences of those deficits. So, but for the IMF, this also, and the IMF knows that there is a strong chance that the government, like whatever government is asking for the loan, will default on that loan, but they still give the loan to the government. Why? Because it's political leverage. Because when they give the loan, they don't just give the loan, they give the loan with certain conditions. They say, okay, we're giving you this loan with our condition and our terms and condition. And one of the terms and conditions that we want you to apply this and that policy. That's what happened with the structural adjustment program in the 1980s, the late 1980s, because there was a massive recession. I think it was a global recession, and it hit African countries pretty severely. So in order to get out of the recession, first, many African countries did the Keynesian approach. They used debt to revitalize the economy. And then when the IMF loaned them that money, they say what we want you guys to do is to liberalize some industries. So that worked for some countries, but it didn't work for others. But this is to show that the IMF doesn't just give you the money; it gives you the money with terms and conditions. Like the terms and conditions it's not just you paying back the loan, but because it's institutions and government, therefore there are political motives being played there. So the IMF wants to make sure that many African countries implement some of their agendas. Some African countries are not, do not want to, but when you go and you default on the loan, now you have no choice. Your hands are tied. So yeah, so that's what happens.
Yeah, so I think the United States, and especially the ones who are more hawkish towards China, they're characterizing these loans as predatory. Would you still say that they are predatory if they know that the government is likely to default, and would you say the same about the IMF loans? Are
yeah,
both,
absolutely.
So
absolutely.
they're both
Yeah,
colonial and predatory.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It is there. They are predatory because they already know that they have leverage over those countries. So that you're getting in business with someone who is not at the same level as you. You have complete superiority over that person. So knowing that, you're just trying to take advantage of the person. And this is what happens also because African political leaders as well, one of the issues is that they are not patriotic enough. And that's why the Chinese have an advantage because the Chinese are making deals with African governments, not even with uh, private African companies. No, we have with African governments. So the African leaders are the one basically selling some resources that should be, that should be collectivized because I believe that some resources should be collectivized. But my stance on collectivization, I'm against it. But when it comes to certain sectors, I understand why they're nationalized and why they should be. But they basically sell those to the Chinese, and now the Chinese own those things. So now you see China owning resources in a land that is not theirs. So will Africa be developed? Absolutely. Africa will be economically developed. But the question is by who? Is Africa going to be developed by Africans? Or is Africa going to be developed by the United States or by the Chinese? So far, it looks like the Chinese are the one. And one thing that the Chinese are extremely good at is that instead of them imposing their culture on you, they're the one who embrace your culture. Think about this. They come to your country. They embrace your culture, make you think that they love your culture. So now you see Africans, with their hands all happy, they think that the Chinese love them. No, they don't love you. They're here to take your resources and leave. They're not here to play with you. But now one of the ways for them to basically dupe Africans is by pretending that they care about African culture. So therefore, African become less wary of Chinese intentions, and the Chinese take advantage of that.
So do you believe that the United States' dollar is in decline, and that on the global stage, China and this new BRICS system will serve as a serious competitor, knowing that Africa is kind of embracing China because they're selling it this way? I think that the United States is pretty short-sighted. They've spent the last 20 years using military might and sanctions regimes and exporting inflation abroad, that and then also trying to enforce their values on these countries that African countries are now looking for an alternative, one that is more acceptable. And to an extent, like, libertarians are very open to the idea of like trade, and what China is doing superficially appears right until you realize that they're predatory loans. But we could serve as a real competitor by abandoning the foreign policy and the monetary policy we've been pursuing, and just opening up markets and pursuing free trade. I wonder what you think about just the future of the dollar, and whether it really is being threatened by the Chinese and the Russians.
Sure. So at the end of the day, one thing that is important to understand about money is that the value of money, specifically fiat money, is the value of money or fiat money is based on faith, on the belief that this thing has value. Compared to gold, we know that gold has value. We don't have to dispute that at all. That's why the gold standard has been the monetary system for a very long time. But now that we have paper, the only way for us to believe that paper we're using has value is because the government issuing that paper claims that thing has value. So now when we look at the global market, at the end of the day, the US dollar is in a weak position. Now, I don't know if the US dollar will completely collapse, because in order for the US dollar to completely collapse and be completely relevant, one thing has to happen. Wall Street has to collapse. So long as Wall Street remains the dominant financial system in the world, the dollar will still remain relevant. Sure, some African countries may embrace, the BRICS alternative to the US dollar. But some people at the end of the day prefer using the dollar to trade. That's what it is. It's all about faith. Like, we are all used to the US dollar. Let me tell you this. This is an anecdote. I used to live in Nairobi, Kenya. So that's why I actually learned English. And during vacation, I went to the French school there. And during vacations, I used to go see my dad, who was living in Tanzania, the neighboring country south of Kenya. So my sister and I, we will always take the bus to go from Kenya to Tanzania. And we have to stop at the border and pay for the visa to go. But the payment of that visa fee is not in Kenyan shillings. It is not in Tanzanian shillings. It is in the US dollar. What that tells you, Kenya and Tanzania speak the same language. They both speak Swahili. They pretty much have the same values. That's why the idea of creating like a United States of Eastern Africa became pretty relevant, because Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda, they have the same cultural values. And yet, going from Kenya to Tanzania, I still use the dollar to pay for that visa fee. So what that tells you, it tells you that the US dollar is the currency that we trust for international exchange. That's what people feel more comfortable with. Even two countries that speak the same language would rather use the dollar. Even when the Zimbabwean currency completely declined and became worthless, the currency that replaced the Zimbabwean dollar was what? It was the dollar. Even in Argentina, inflation is so high that if you want to buy a house, you have to buy it in US dollars. Why not in Brazilian real or in Chinese yuan? Why the dollar? Because the dollar is the currency that at the end of the day we trust, because we trust the American financial institutions to preserve the transparency and the strength of the US dollar, even though the US dollar is currently weakening. But at the end of the day, we believe that so long as the global financial system, which is supported by the United States, is still functioning, the dollar will be around. That's the bottom line. Because, as I said, the dollar is fiat. Fiat is based on faith. Because the US government say, hey, we decree that this is money, and it is backed by the full faith and transparency of the US government. So you have to believe us. And people, that's what the dollar is saying here.
Are you concerned at all about the Saudi Arabia's new peace deal that was mediated by China with Iran? Do you think that at all is weakening the petrodollar, given that we gave them military guarantees and they've priced oil in the dollar? Now that whole institution seems to be collapsing. And if, demand for the dollar globally decreases, whether it completely goes away, those dollars will still, I think, flood back to the US, and there is risk of significant inflation as a result. Do you have the same concerns?
To some extent, yeah, but everything depends on for how long things will keep going that way. Because right now, what Xi Jinping is trying to do is to try to rally pretty much the eastern side of the world to his cause. And at the end of the day, the Saudis are looking out for their own interest. Here, yeah, the news say, oh yeah, we are done pleasing the United States, but this is all garbage. They're not done. If the US come with a better deal, they're gonna come with the US. So it's all politics. It's all, in my opinion. I could be wrong, but I think it's all theater. Yes, for now, like China is presenting a better deal for Saudi Arabia, but it's not to the point where Saudi Arabia will completely abandon its entire relationship structure with the United States. I don't think it will go that far.
Yeah. And I think the Ukraine war is kind of affirming what you're saying, because it appears that a lot of these countries, what they're doing is they're kind of taking a neutral position and they're waiting it out to see who ends up being the bigger force. And that's why Africa hasn't really they haven't complied with the US's vision in Ukraine. And we're actually seeing a lot of that in Europe and the Middle East as well. Some of our allies, supposed allies, like Israel, in those recent leaks that were released 2 weeks ago, we found out that Israel was saying that they would only give aid to Ukraine if the United States guaranteed that they would give aid for direct attacks to Iran. So I think it's affirming what you're saying, that a lot of the countries are actually just holding out to see what happens. Now, you did talk a little bit about money and inflation here, and that actually makes me want to segue and pivot to a different conversation. Sure. We've talked a little bit about your economic theory and your economic philosophy. Do you consider yourself an Austrian, or would you? I know you had some pretty big critiques of it when we originally talked about it, and you definitely have more of an affinity for econometrics and math and economics. So how would you identify yourself economically and politically?
Sure. So politically, I am a classical liberal. I consider more myself a classical liberal, a conservative, than an actual libertarian. And economically, I consider myself more of a part of the Chicago School or the Virginia School of Economics, basically the guys of public choice, or more than an Austrian. That doesn't mean I'm not an Austrian at all. As a matter of fact, I started as an Austrian. I think Austrian economics is great to start learning the fundamentals of economics. It's good. Austrians are great at that. If you have completely zero understanding of economics, using the learning economics through the Austrian school is the best path to go with. But as now you start getting, once your knowledge of economics is pretty much proficient, and you want to start getting into deeper, more technical economics, that's where, in my opinion, Austrian economics become short-sighted. And one of the reasons why I think that is because I have an issue with the fact that Murray Rothbard brought libertarian thinking into economic analysis. I genuinely have a problem with that. That's why, if you know, I never post about Rothbard on my post. I love Mises. I love Hayek, Ludwig von Bawerk, Karl Menger. When they did economics, they actually did economic analysis. It wasn't based on a sort of political ideology. When Menger basically started the Austrian school, he started with an observation. And it's that observation that created the marginal revolution, right? The marginal theory of utility. He saw that when people use the same item, the same commodity, over and over, the level of satisfaction decrease. This is an observation, and it's from that observation he formulated a theory. So you see here that he started with the inductive method, right? You start with an observation, the data doesn't have to be quantitative necessarily. The data is just an observation. You start with the data, you start with an observation, and based on that observation, you derive a theory, a generalization to explain something. Now my problem with Mises was praxeology. That's my major issue with him, not his theory itself. I agree with most of Mises' theories, but I never thought that praxeology was the right method of economic analysis, because the purpose of developing a theory is to be able to predict to be able to predict what could happen. Because if, for example, I ask you how the Chinese Exclusive Act impacted the US economy in the 1800s, in the late 1800s, if you use praxeology to tell me that, the answer you will give me will be very vague. But if you use quantitative tools, then your answer will be more precise. So what praxeology does is that praxeology is good to create a theoretical framework, right? So a theoretical apparatus but that's where it stops. After you create your theoretical apparatus, that theory that you created needs to be tested to see the validity of it. Because it's not because something is theoretically true that it is empirically true. So especially in economics, I think it is important that whatever theory we develop is tested. And that's where that's my major disagreement with Mises. Besides that, I always agree. I love Ludwig von Mises. He was a tenacious economist, a true classical liberal, and but he was stubborn on his praxeology, and I was like, no. But my major disagreement with the Austrian school as a whole was with Rothbard when he brought libertarianism into economic analysis, which now turned the whole Austrian school into some sort of like ideological cultish thing. And I don't think that's a good look for the Austrian school, because the Austrian school brings a lot of value. When you look at the business cycle, this is extremely important. And the Austrian brought a lot of value to economics with the business cycle. The business cycle, for example, it's here. This is pure economic analysis. Whether you agree with it or not, it is pure economic analysis. There was no libertarian thinking there. That's why the Austrian school is respected when it comes to business cycles. It's true that many schools today do not know what the Austrian school is, and I think Austrian economics should be taught, especially Austrian thinking should be taught in schools, because they bring a lot of value to economics. But it's important for people to separate libertarianism and ethics with economic analysis and with free market economic analysis.
So I'm wondering about a little more about your critiques of praxeology. So is your issue that it begins with like what is typically called the synthetic a priori observation of human action, and that then it's a deductive method from that principle? Do you disagree that economics starts with that observation that humans act?
No, not the fact that humans act. Of course, we all act. But the question is, we act toward what? Because the fact that humans act is very broad. Animals act too. As a matter of fact, we all act. But we act toward what? Is toward a specific goal that we are able now to determine how to get there. And I think that's where praxeology does not emphasize on. Yes, human beings act because they're rational, the rational species, but it's not enough to understand, because we need to understand people's goals, and it's based on their goals that we're able to determine not just the path or the patterns to get there, but also the outcome. Of course, don't get me wrong, like quantitative economics has a lot of shortcomings too. But because, for example, if let's say, Liam, you use praxeology to predict about the minimum wage, I can simply contradict you and say, well, yes, the minimum wage creates unemployment, but by how much? Does it mean that everyone is unemployed right now? Because if we look at the data, for example, unemployment is right now at 3.5%. Instead of increasing, which is what the Feds are trying to do to tame inflation, unemployment still decreasing. and there's still minimum wage. So how come unemployment is decreasing when there's a minimum wage? What would be your answer to that? So if you're using the data to come up with an answer, that would make more sense than if you're just using praxeology, because normally if you use praxeology to apply to the minimum wage, we're supposed to see an increase in unemployment based on the fact that minimum wage leads to more unemployment because you're paying people a wage that is above market value, and employers cannot afford it. But when we look at the evidence, it's completely contrary to that. So that's why I think what the Austrians should do, in my opinion, is to combine both. Praxeology is good to determine a theory, to create a theoretical framework. But the Austrians should go a step further. They should test their theories, because Austrians have very great theories, but it is abstract. It's not enough. It's all in here. When you develop a theory, the goal of developing a theory is to be able to implement it. Otherwise, what's the point? What's the point of, or unless people love to do mental gymnastics. I personally don't like doing mental gymnastics. I'm a very pragmatic guy. So when I develop a theory, the goal is to implement my theory. So I think it's important for Austrians to go a step further and go toward the scientific aspect, basically testing the theory and implementing. And don't get me wrong, it's not all Austrians who reject empiricism. It's just a group. It's not all Austrians who reject empiricism. At least that's why, because I know that there's some Austrian economists, for example. I forgot. There was an Austrian economist who basically used econometrics to show to show the business cycle and the recession of 2008. I forgot his name, but he wrote a paper where he used a lot of statistical techniques to prove that. So that shows that, yes, he's Austrian, but he did not limit himself just to the praxeological approach. And that's why, and this paper he wrote is actually used by many Austrians to vindicate the Austrian business cycle, to prove that the business cycle is actually empirically valid.
Yeah, well, I'm wondering a little bit about, you said that humans are rational, and I know that like mainstream economics likes to when they're solving for like utility functions and stuff like that, they have a certain kind of packed in definition of what it means for a person to be rational. And I think the Austrian critique, and I haven't studied economics, I'm a philosophy major, and I come at libertarianism first, and then I discovered Austrian. So you might have some problems with that. But my understanding is that the critique comes from praxeology, where it's the understanding that humans act, and they act towards certain ends, that they have preferences, and then they use certain means to achieve those ends. And those are all subjective, and it's demonstrated through their action. And I think that the way that rationality would be defined through that analysis is the use of means to achieve ends. And so I guess, what is your idea of rationality? Do you think that would you say, like other mainstream economics or economists, that certain behavior that isn't proved by like a utility function or something like that is irrational? I guess, how would you phrase, what's the language that you would use around rationality, and what's the purpose of you using that term?
No, when it comes to the Austrian on the concept of rationality, they are correct indeed, because, and I can use my own example, right? I can write a book. I can write a 500, 600 page book, put my heart and soul in it, do all the research I want. I put that on the market and the book doesn't sell. So you see that people they're not interested. This is subjective. Of course, there is the concept of subjectivity in economics. It's crucial. They're subjective. Like this is a market reaction. People are not interested in. Basically, there is no correlation between what the consumer wants and the amount of the amount of labor that are put in it, right? So when it comes now to so when it comes to rationality, it's everything depends on what people want. Like, what is the preferences? What is the preferences? What are the choice and values? Because people choose according to what they like and their values. So that's why we always end up having different choices. But at the same time, you see that people can act in a unanimous way during certain situations. And one of those situations are when you look at, for example, supply and demand. If you increase the price of a good or a service, what is going to happen? Most people will start will start buying less of that good or service of the price you increase. This is pretty much universal. So this is not like a matter of like individual choice, like each person. Sure, some people who have the means may be able to keep purchasing it, but most people won't be able to, and vice versa. If you reduce basically the availability of goods and service, or if you increase the availability of goods and service, then what is going to happen? More people will start pouring and buying more of that. So this choice here is rational, but it is universal. This choice here can be quantitatively demonstrated. But at the end of the day, the way people make choices in the market is that people, of course, purchase things for their own reasons. People can buy the very same thing for different reasons, but they keep buying the same thing regardless. So I think what neoclassicals and other schools of thought focus on is the fact that people are buying it despite the reason of buying it, while the Austrians focus more on why are they buying. So the why is what differentiates or makes people unique in their decision to go after something. While the other school of thoughts, they're more like, well, if you diminish this and increase this, then people will react to certain. It's kind of like a machine.
Yeah.
So right. So like, as I say, like you can, if you increase the availability of iPhones, more people will buy iPhones. That you can quantitatively demonstrate it. But now, why people will buy iPhones? That one you don't know. Liam may buy his iPhone because he wants to use it for GPS. I don't know. Let us assume that you have a sister. Your sister will maybe want to buy iPhone just for the pictures. Who knows, right? So, but because you want to buy the iPhone for the GPS and your sister want to buy the iPhone for the pictures, makes the purpose of buying the iPhone different for two different individuals.
So when I was first learning Austrian economics, I watched a lot of like the Mises Institute's lectures from Mises University, and the way that I understand Austrian economics is that their critique of mathematics isn't it's not properly meant to be understood to be that math has no role in economics, but that there are certain epistemological limitations to math, and that, like, when you look at mainstream economics and they use a lot of models, that is not actually how we decide things. Like when we're at the grocery store, we're not like looking at a utility function.
Yeah.
We are, often it's reflexive. It's like, well, I'm hungry. That looks good. And
I'm gonna buy it. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I was looking for a Mises quote, and the way he puts it is, let me find it. I wanted to read this because I just want to see your reaction to it, because it might be that you are just critical of a certain base of Austrian economics.
Yeah. No, that's what I'm saying. I'm not like fundamentally against Austrian economics at all. As I say, like I studied as an Austrian myself.
Mhm.
I did. It's just that when it comes to, I think, let me put it this way. I think when it comes to policies, and maybe that's where I have my issue with the Austrian school is that the Austrian school is not very policy driven, and I am, because I think that whatever economic theory we are developing is to apply to policies, right? So, and that's where like I'm very heavy on testing theories, because we want to test it to see how it's going to appear in the world, like how people will react to it, and if it's worth being implemented as a policy. Because that's what the Austrians are more academic, the more, that's why they focus more on the abstract. While me, I'm a very pragmatic and very practical guy. Like that's why I've been insisting on the fact that Austrians should push forward, because they have great theories. And I think the theories are valuable and they should be, and they deserve to be implemented. But in order to implement them, they need to be tested. Because if you don't test, how are you going to know that if it's going to work or not? So that's where my main issue is like if you develop something, if you develop something abstract, you have to you have to implement it. And it comes back to the philosophical discussion between rationalism and empiricism. You know, continental Europe, now we are in your field of philosophy. Continental Europe, they're very rational. They believe in the rationalist movement. You know, like you gain knowledge just from intuition or something like that. Like you don't need you don't need experience to know something. While the British, the ones that I'm siding with, I believe that in order to gain knowledge from something, you need experience. Of course, it's nuance. It cannot be, it's not either rational or rationalist or empiricist. It's no, because for example, uh, when you look at, I don't know, let me put it this. So when you look at, for example, your skin color, I look at my skin color, I know that it's black. I don't need experience to see that I'm black, right? This is here the rationalist approach. But if, for example, you want to let me find another example to emphasize the empiricist approach. Uh, if, for example, you want to, I don't know, you want to become a lawyer, you have to go to law school. So how can you become a lawyer, especially today? How can you become a lawyer without experiencing law school, right? Like going through mock trials, taking a lot of doing those exams, learning constitutional law and all of that. This is an experience. So, uh, so my approach is that in order for us to understand something and to see if it's valid or not, it ought to be tested. So we need to we need to put it to the test of experience so that we can determine with more accuracy if it's worth it or not. So that's how I approach it. So because I'm very policy oriented and the Austrians are not. So I think maybe that is my fundamental issue with the Austrian schools, is the fact that they don't push beyond just the fact of developing theories. They don't go toward, you know, implementing what they're developing. They just stop at the theory.
Yeah. So I found the quote that I wanted to read.
Sure.
So Mises, reacting to the idea that economics, you know, is epistemologically limited in what it can predict, he says, this is not to say that future human actions are utterly unpredictable. They can, in a certain way, be anticipated to some extent, but the methods applied in such anticipations and their scope are logically and epistemologically entirely different from those applied in anticipating natural events and from their scope. So the argument is kind of, it's like we are not machines, right? That I like to quote the Dostoevsky quote about man is not a piano key, that we have free will and that we aren't like the natural sciences, that we aren't machines that we can just plot out on a graph and predict. So the way that I understand Austrian economics and its ability to predict through the deductive method, I think is best explained through the
causal
business,
realist approach.
the causal realist approach, and then also the business cycle theory. Because if we use the deductive method from human action, we determine that humans act towards certain end using certain means. From this deductive method, we also, as it's argued, we discover that we are limited by time, and then from that we learn time preference, and that Austrian economics, its contribution is the element of time. It's often left out of mainstream economics. And then that's where we get into interest theory. And then, from there we build, to the theory of the business cycle. Do you have a critique of any of that? Would you say that it needs to be tested beyond the theory? Because I think the Mises's idea of theory and why theory is important is that when we observe events, there's the problem of correlation and causation. That, if we observe a economic recession, and that recession is preceded by the inflation of the monetary supply, and we were to plot it out and try to predict that, we wouldn't necessarily be able to connect the increase of the money supply with the coming recession. We wouldn't be able to say that it's causal. We would say that it's correlated, and you could empirically prove that over time. But why theory is important is because the theory then is able to kind of bridge that gap, I guess. Mm-hmm. That's my understanding, and I might get corrected in the comments, but I wonder what you think about that. Would you say that math is epistemologically limited, and do you agree with Mises in that respect?
Is math epistemologically limited? Yes, it is, of course. But one thing I want to emphasize here is that when Mises said, I agree with Mises when he says, we're not machines. Indeed, we're not machines. We have free will. So that's why we can sort of like not predict what humans will do. However, human beings will always repeat actions that benefits them. So if, right, you are doing something that enables you, that leads you to a positive outcome, you will keep doing the same thing until it no longer leads you to that very same outcome. So we always say we never change the winning team, right? You're not going to change a habit that leads you to a positive result. So long as that habit enables you to get what you want, you're going to still doing the same thing. And therefore, this one we can predict. Because it's all about semantics and language. How Mises put it. Overall, of course, Mises is right in the sense that we cannot predict what human beings will do all the time and every time. Because we're human beings, today we can decide to change up things. We have free will, like we decide. We are consequential species. But when we do things, and that's why, especially in business, you see companies using quantitative economics to understand human behavior, right? Like Amazon, Tesla, Netflix. That's what they do, because they are using quantitative economics. Because why? Because people are doing the same thing over and over because they enjoy it. So when people enjoy something, they keep doing it, and based on the fact that they keep doing it, you can predict that they will keep doing it again. So when, for example, right, you look at Netflix, the CEO of Netflix, I remember he implemented like a new business rule for Netflix, and for some reason the stock price of Netflix tanked. So here people reacted differently to what he anticipated. So what he did is that he sent a survey to understand what people want. So when he sent that survey and implemented what people want, the stock price of Netflix kept going back up, and it keeps going on and on. Why? Because people love what Netflix is giving them. So therefore the retention customer aspect of Netflix is constant because people enjoy, they keep watching whatever, they love the way Netflix is servicing them. Therefore they're not going to change. Therefore Netflix can predict that based on the past year or year and a half or 2 years, we can predict that we will still have the same number of customers, because so far it looks at what we've been doing is working. But it is also important to understand that past performance do not guarantee future results. That's where the data is limited. The data is helpful to help us understand previous behavior. We can try to predict, but it doesn't mean that the prediction will be necessarily correct either. So you see that on both hands, it's still limited. Like, I don't think there is one that has the upper hand than other. So Mrs. globally is right in the sense that we're not machine, so we cannot predict human behavior at all times. But in the short term, we can predict human behavior by using mathematics or statistics, because based on past actions that are being repeated, you can determine that, especially if that past action, if the outcome of that past action brings a positive outcome to the individual will keep doing the same thing until until some sort of event happen and the individual decide to change course.
Yeah, I really like what you said about its ability to explain past behavior, because I think I've heard this in Austrian circles. I think that this is completely consistent with the Austrian school and the historical method and the historical approach in applying economics to historical theory. Because I know you might have problems with Rothbard, but in America's Great Depression, I mean, he does this at many points. And I think I actually have another quote here from Mises. I don't know if it's related. It says, praxeology, the a priori science of human action, and more specifically, it's up to now best developed part, economics provides in its field a consummate interpretation of past events recorded and a consummate anticipation of the effects to be expected from future actions of a definite kind. I'm not going to pretend to be able to argue with you, since you've studied economics and I'm only a philosophy major. But I've really enjoyed all of this. I guess the last question I wanted to ask you, so you're definitely not an anarchist then.
No.
You would identify more with like Walter Williams, Milton Friedman. Yeah, I actually there was a lot that I wanted to talk about in this interview, but you're just so prolific. It's hard to
keep
put
up
it all into an hour. I wanted to talk about Walter Williams and Thomas Sowell.
Sure.
You've written a few books on African Americans and inequality. I guess maybe that'll be my last question. If you want to kind of pitch those books and talk about your work there.
Sure.
I think that's really fascinating. I grew up, I probably got into economics because of my interest in Thomas Sowell. And then I later found Walter Williams, who unfortunately passed just a couple of years ago. And his work on, he has the one argument that discrimination in the South was enforced by the government, that it wasn't capitalism that resulted in discrimination, and that with these boxcar companies, this was a result of Southern governments requiring the boxcar companies to segregate. And that was very influential on me, and then my understanding of free markets. So yeah, why don't you talk about a little bit about your works in that field?
Sure. Yeah. So I wrote 2 major books on Black American history or social theory, I would say. Uh, the economic condition of Black America in the 20th century is perhaps my most famous book to date. And I wrote also this book, which is Black Culture and Generational Poverty. So these are the two main books I wrote on Black Americans. So first, the economic condition. So that book basically explained the economic evolution of Black people throughout the 20th century. And what you find here in the book is how Black people actually were better off economically when they relied on market means rather than government, especially before the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Because before the Civil Rights Act of 1964, there was no welfare state, like at least for Black people. The welfare state was already there, but Black people could not really benefit from it until Lyndon Johnson passed that policy. So Black people had to rely on themselves. And you see that Black people were better off economically, but they had no political rights. So what happened was that Black people became more focused on political rights, and they start abandoning the economic rights. So because they start focusing on political rights, so the right to vote, the right to participate in political activities and run for office and all this stuff, therefore they start to focus more on politics. And of course, the Democrats, they took advantage of that to secure, as we know, the Black vote. So now, like, Black people became now more dependent on government. So they're like, oh, we can rely on the government resources to achieve certain ends. But when you look at what Black people have achieved by using government resources, is far less than what Black people achieved just by using market means. Because back in the day, since there was no government resources available to Black people, there was segregation, redlining policy, so Black people could not rely on anything at all. They had to rely on themselves. So they rely on entrepreneurship. They rely on localism. So you see Black people starting like barbershops. They were focusing on trades. A lot of them went to vocational school. And that was helping them out to put food on the table. So you see a Black person being a plumber, he could make good money and provide for his family. But one of the things Lyndon Johnson did was, we're going to make college education available to everyone by giving them loans. No problem. The intention is genuine, but the consequences, as we see today, is completely it's bad. Now, like, college costs almost $100,000 for a 4-year education just to get a $40,000 job. So think about this: you are paying $100K in education to work for a salary of 40K. Before that, education was cheap because in order for schools to have customers, so students coming, they have to make sure that the price was affordable for people. But because you see, Lyndon Johnson made that, and he passed those affirmative action laws to even discriminate more. It became harder for Black people. First of all, sure, they could go to school, but they had to take loans, and it was hard for some Blacks to get a good, decent job to pay back the loans. And on top of that, now Blacks were hired on the premise of the skin color rather than the performance. So they were hired in position in which they cannot perform. So they became a liability to the companies they were working for. So all of these, basically, you see that Black people relying on government resources did not help them completely. And in the second one here, in Black culture and generational poverty, in this one, I am basically explaining how I'm explaining basically why the reason why Black people are not economically, politically, and socially where they should be is because of hood culture, because they embrace certain counterproductive habits that preventing them from being abiding citizens and to produce and provide for society as well. Because you see, like, hood culture is, to me personally, hood culture is very stupid. It's a very stupid short-term culture that despise hard work, that despise delayed gratification. Because when you look at all the minorities, you look at Indian Americans, you look at Arab Americans, you look at Asian Americans, specifically the Eastern Asians, so Japanese, Chinese, Koreans. These guys had a fair share of discrimination in the United States too. Okay, like you had the Chinese Exclusion Act. Literally, it was the first law in the United States that was explicitly racist, saying that Asian people, specifically Chinese, are not allowed to work in key industries. So what the Chinese did, they rely on the market. They rely on market means, once again. But you see that Asians like embrace certain values, that makes them today actually the wealthiest community in the United States. Asians are wealthier than most white people in the country. So, but Black people, like, we start embracing the culture of victimization, and we always believe that government is the one that is going to help us achieving certain ends. But every time the government is trying to quote unquote help us, it leads to disastrous results rather than relying on ourselves. So that's what I explained basically in the book.
And then in your most recent book, I want to give you an opportunity to pitch this one too, because it came out in January.
Yeah, January.
So this is the second part of a history of wealth distribution in the United States, and I was reading the synopsis of it here, and it seems very interesting because, am I understanding it right that you are not taking inequality to be necessarily a bad thing?
No, it's not. It's inequality is normal. It's to me, it's a good thing. You see, people, and this is where Marx and Thomas Piketty won. What they did was to correlate an economic phenomenon with an ethical, I won't say phenomenon, but with an ethical concept. So Marx and Thomas Piketty what they successfully did was proof is not the right word, was to make people believe that equality is a good thing and inequality is a bad thing. So today, if you ask the average American, should we redistribute wealth? He will tell you yes, because it sounds noble, it sounds morally correct. But when you ask him if you ask that average American, give me the economic reasoning why we should redistribute wealth, that person cannot. That tells you everything you need to know. So people support the redistribution of wealth on a moral basis rather than an economic basis. And the problem is that people do not think economically. People do not think in terms of trade-off. So in the book, what I'm trying to do was to basically explain the history of how the economic system of the United States developed and how wealth distribution evolved throughout the evolution of the country as well. So, of course, at first it was land. Land has always been the most precious resource to build wealth. And you had the American gentry, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, all the founding fathers. Once you get the book, you will see that all of them were super wealthy. All these guys were super wealthy. But you see the level of inequality that already exists. And then Andrew Jackson became president. He brought populism into American politics. So now you see that the United States moved from an aristocratic republic to a democratic republic. Now the actual class struggle was structured, because in the democratic society, every aspect of society is considered a unit, a potential voter. And that's why Andrew Jackson was able to win the election, because he was able to appeal to the common man, the working class, who became in itself a voting bloc. So now you see that people vote based on, their income range, their sometimes their race, sometimes on some social issues that concern their class, the social class, and etc. So the Democratic Republic enabled it, enlarged the American electorate, but it also emphasized class struggle. And what you and my favorite part of the book is basically the Gilded Age. I talk with Tom Woods about it a lot. We focus more on that than anything else. But the Gilded Age I think, is the most misunderstood period in American economic history. And the reason why is because we vilified the robber barons for, using the exploitation theory of Marx. They exploit people, they take their labor, and they enrich themselves. But what people don't understand is that, first of all, those guys took the risk to start a company. And let us not forget that in the 1800s, electricity was not even there at the time. It didn't come until like the very late 1800s, maybe early 1900s. So everything was physical. And so that means that most business industries were capital intensive. It required a lot of capital for the operations to keep moving. If those business ventures failed, the founders of those business ventures were the ones who had to pay back those loans that were taken with the banks. The worker can get another job somewhere else. But that part, they don't talk about it. Don't get me wrong, the robber barons were ruthless. They did some pretty shitty stuff. I'm not gonna say they didn't. I'm not gonna say they were immaculate. But at the end of the day, what they did was to take the United States to a completely unprecedented level of economic achievement and improvement of living standard. Because thanks, for example, to Andrew Carnegie, the United States became the most proficient and the best producer of steel. Thanks to Rockefeller, we had access to light through the use of kerosene. And so now people can be more productive at night. So people have to go to bed like much later and be more productive. And we use even oil for other things that improve our lives. When you look at Vanderbilt facilitated transportation in the United States. Of course, all of them, they did that for the selfish reasons, but it improved the lives of everyone, specifically the working class, who had a higher wage than the American working class had a higher wage than the European working class. That is interesting. I also talk about the history of the banking system in the United States. That's in that book, in that chapter specifically, you will see a very interesting analysis of Austrians and Chicago. And it will surprise you, but I side more with the Austrians on that. Because when you look at the time of the free banking era, we had less economic crisis than the national banking era. The Chicago School support the national banking era, but the national banking era means what? We have more government regulating the banking system. We had more crisis compared to the free banking era, where not that there was zero crisis, but they were very minimal. And the Austrians support free banking. So you see that on that note, I side more with the Austrians. And then I talk about the period between World War I and World War II. And then I talk about the Great Depression, then the Great Recession, talk about Reagan, how, inequality, the so-and-so inequality under Reagan was bad, although it led to great outcomes. Talk about Bill Clinton, how Bill Clinton was not at all a lefty. Bill Clinton was actually a right-wing guy because there was a lot of economic inequalities under Bill Clinton, but economic output increased significantly under his leadership. Then I talk about the Great Recession and quantitative easing, basically all the way prior to the pandemic. So yeah.
Well, if you do you want to let people know where they can find your stuff?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's they can find it on the website of my publishing company, and they can find it on Amazon as well.
Great. And I'll link to all of that at decentralizedrevolution.com/104. And before I let you go, I just wanted to underscore the point about entrepreneurs. I think that the role, or one of the major roles in society that they play, is that they forego income, and sometimes they actually will lose all of their income, but they guarantee wages for workers.
That's what I'm experiencing right now.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, like I'm telling you, it's and you see, and that's the part that people don't understand. And people say, "Oh yeah, entrepreneurs, business owners," and that's why the tax system favors business owners. That's what people don't understand. You see, when people, for example, say, "How come?" I actually have a friend who said, like, he texted me 2 days ago. He was saying, like, he's like, "Man, this is effed up. Like, how come Donald Trump pays $750 in taxes and Joe Biden pays $100K in taxes?" I said, "Well, it makes sense why Donald Trump pays $750 in taxes. He's a business owner. When you're a business owner, you have the privilege to deduct every expense that you do, because you own a business. So the phone you buy, right, this iPhone, you can buy it and say, "Hey, it's for the business. It's for..." So basically, you deduct that. You can buy a computer, even a house, and say it's for the business. So, and in this case, what happens is that your tax liability is reduced. Basically, you avoid paying taxes. I know when we say avoid paying taxes, it sounds bad, but that's what it is. It's simply reducing your tax liability. And that's why you see many corporations, people like Mark Zuckerberg, like, that's why those guys don't pay taxes. Because for a long time they forego the ability to generate revenue. Even like, let's say for example, a dentist, right? A dentist, the guy went to he did his college, he did college, he went to dental school, he started his medical practice. For the first few years, he needs a secretary. So what happens? He gets his secretary. He has to pay that secretary. But that dentist himself doesn't have any salary. All the money that his practice makes, he has to reinvest that in the business to buy more machines, more equipment, and etc. It is only after that he will eventually become richer than his secretary. So for the first few years, his secretary is richer than him. And it kills me when people don't appreciate the risk that entrepreneurs have to take to make things work. And this is one thing where I agree with the Austrians. They're strongly for entrepreneurs. And I love that, because entrepreneurship is what enables a market economy to function. Without entrepreneurs, there's no wealth creation at all.
Yeah, absolutely. And if people want to look into the Austrian perspective of entrepreneurs, I would highly recommend everyone go over to our episode with Per Byland. He was on our Ask an Austrian series, and he's really specialized in entrepreneurship and the role of the entrepreneur in the economy from an Austrian perspective. But we've been going for about an hour and a half. This is my second time hosting Decentralized Revolution, so I should not make Michael Heiss upset and go too long.
Well, I hope most of the people in Mrs. Caucus will not hate me for my views on Rothbard specifically. I know people are very attached to Rothbard, but I think, like, I don't I just want to emphasize this. I don't hate Murray Rothbard as a man. Of course, I don't know the guy. I just didn't like, what I don't like is the fact that he put libertarianism into economics, and he could be intolerant sometimes, but that's my personal view. I know some people will be mad, but
well, the role of the Decentralized Revolution podcast is to kind of be outward facing with the Mises Caucus and interview people who are Austrian and libertarian adjacent. We've had a lot of people on who are more conservative minded, and I think that's kind of the role of the caucus, because we're all for coalition building. So that's the idea. Is we're very interested in your work, and we go back quite some time, so I wanted to have you on. But everyone go over to decentralizedrevolution.com/104. I want to thank our co-producer, Simon Kalpin, and also thank Day versus Goliath for all the music you hear on Decentralized Revolution. And thanks to everyone who subscribes to our email list and gives to Mises Pack at takehumanaction.com, and everyone who shares, rates, reviews, and subscribes to Decentralized Revolution. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.